Okay, so it's 2 minutes after 6. I'm going to go ahead and welcome everybody to our event, Justice and Transformation, Houston Women on Climate Action. So my name is Ashley. I'm going to be the moderator today, so I'll just be asking questions, but mostly in the background along with Lisa and Julia. We are hosting this event as part of a grant that we received through the American Library Association for climate resilience. So we are really excited. This is our first event of our grant series. So thank you everybody for joining. We want to welcome participants in Owl Together, alumni, students, parents, as well as the broader Houston community, and thank our co-sponsors, Rice Fondren Library's Green Team, Rice's Center for Environmental Studies, Citizens Environmental Coalition, and Rice Environmental Society. And next, we will have all of our panelists introduce themselves and tell us how they came to work in the environmental justice field. So we'll start with Amy.
Hello, good evening. My name is Amy Dinn. I am an attorney at Lone Star Legal Aid, and I manage our environmental justice team on behalf of our Equitable Development Initiative. I started working with Lone Star Legal Aid just after the 2017 election. I had been serving on the board and been doing pro bono work as a private attorney in private practice for many years, and just felt called that this was the time to start working directly with communities given the absence of a safety net that we would likely see under the current administration. And it has been one of the most rewarding things that I've ever chosen to do in my life. And I really enjoy working with the communities, and I can't wait to share a little bit about that perspective that I've gained from this position this evening.
Cymene?
Okay, great. So my name is Cymene Howe. I'm a professor in the Department of Anthropology at Rice. And I've been doing quite a bit of research on environments and environmental justice for the last decade or so after moving to Houston. And part of what happened in the move to Houston was this recognition that you have this very paradoxical space in some ways, because you have obviously the petrochemical industry that's so influential and so toxic in so many ways. And then you also have the medical industry, with the medical center so prominent in the city, like such an important part of what the city is. And so it creates this really weird juxtaposition where you have something that's fairly toxic in its production and its contamination of the environment. And then at the same time, you have a community of caregivers and an impulse to provide health and well-being for people from all over the world, kind of living in the same space. So I think that Houston itself has been a very interesting place for me to think through some of these questions of environmental justice and to really orient my research now all around those kinds of questions, whether it's here in the United States or whether it's outside of the United States in my field work. So I found that really, really compelling. And I've come to the recognition over time that really environmental justice is the preeminent issue of our time, because all other social conditions kind of fall into this context and kind of meta category of environment, right? There's no social interaction that takes place outside of environments. And so if we think about the struggle for racial justice, if we think about labor rights, for example, if we think about sexism and gender discrimination, sort of every kind of social issue that we can imagine addressing or that we're committed to has to exist within this context of environments. And so if we don't live in an environment that's healthy and safe and providing for the well-being of everyone, then we can't really fully pursue any of those other issues either. So it's come to really inform every single thing I do now, from my research to my teaching, all my writing. And I think it's a really exciting time, and I'm glad to be able to work in this space with such interesting and committed people.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to Denae.
Hi, I'm Denae King. I'm an environmental justice researcher at Texas Southern University. I am originally trained as a molecular toxicologist and worked for a little while with my wonderful cells, kind of treating them and having things all perfectly scheduled. And the truth is, I was bored. And so I began to kind of think about, how do I use my training to really impact communities with people that looked like me? I grew up in one of the EJ communities. And so a lot of what I do now and for the last 15 years is really work with fence line communities. So communities that are in close proximity to industrial sources of pollution, to really help them understand what the environmental exposure looks like. What are they exposed to? Oftentimes they are really the experts and they know exactly what they're experiencing and what they're being exposed to. And they just need a little help with trying to document those exposures, with some help with strategies for mitigating the exposures, and really developing plans that what I like to call that are place based. So plans that really work in their community, that are implemented by them and their leaders, to make sure that they're sustainable and that those programs will really work well. And so I truly enjoy working with EJ communities. I also have the pleasure of working with several of the panelists tonight. So I get to work with Amy and Iris on some of the initiatives that are in some of our communities. And so I'm excited to be here today.
And last, Iris, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hey, everybody. Good evening. Thanks for being with us right now on this. This is my favorite temperature days. So I'm in a happy place right now. I know the native Houstonians are not happy. My name is Iris Gonzalez, and I am the founding coalition director of CEER, the Coalition for Environment, Equity, and Resilience. And CEER is a collaborative that came together shortly after Hurricane Harvey. So we'll be celebrating our 3-year anniversary next month. The group is really focused on advocacy work and policy solutions that impact nature and people. And so really how I came to environmental justice work, I think the first thing that comes to mind is just thinking about my own family in Guadalajara, Jalisco, Mexico, which is where I was born. Seeing a lot of the environmental racism that happens in this country, but to just a magnified degree in a place like Mexico. My uncle, maybe not seeing himself as an organizer, but really being out there and talking with his neighbors and assembling, a group of people to fight back and to really stand up for flooding issues that were happening in his community, and getting cleanups together and talking with decision makers about investments. And when residents were notified about construction that was going to happen in their adjacent park, like literally getting people together to stand in line and block construction workers and vehicles from entering. So I feel like it's in my blood. It's been a part of just being a troublemaker as a part of my family history. But really, I think to kind of connect to the themes of tonight, how I arrived at this particular role as the founding coalition director of CEER really took a lot of women around me who really believed in me and knew me to nudge me to pursue this position. And I know we'll uncover some of that later in our discussion, but I think that the women in this movement from around the world play a really integral role in controlling and shaping the narrative, and also offering up solutions and working in solidarity to advance those solutions. So I'm really pleased to be here with you all tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. So our first question does touch on some of what you guys just talked about in your own personal experiences, and that is, what does environmental justice mean to you, and what would it take to achieve environmental justice? Does one of the panelists want to start with this? Okay, we can move to Denae first then.
Okay. So environmental justice means to me that communities, oftentimes people of color and low income communities, are disproportionately exposed to environmental pollution. And so we see this more, I guess, more and more in the Houston area, and oftentimes along the Gulf Coast, because we have this historical legacy of segregation. And so a lot of the environmental justice and exposures that we see in the South are really directly correlated to segregation and racism in terms of redlining and housing, in terms of, particularly in Houston, in terms of us having no zoning. I think that does not help us. And so I don't know if most people on our webinar tonight realize that in the city of Houston we have no zoning, and so that means that you often have an opportunity to place an unwanted land use place in any community. So there are, other than some of the master plan communities that have deed restrictions, you can place a refinery, you can place a paint shop, you can place any of those kinds of places where you might experience exposures to environmental pollution in or near a neighborhood. And oftentimes that happens in people of color and low income vulnerable communities. And so in order for us to really work to achieve environmental justice, we have to really begin to think about how permitting works, how things are placed in communities, and we also have to really focus on enforcement. And so there is often a lack of enforcement in terms of, how communities can really respond if pollution is happening in their areas. There's a lack of enforcement in terms of the big polluters and whether or not they're going to be fined for for polluting communities. And so if we really want to achieve environmental justice, we have to first really think about how we're placing industrial pollution in communities, and also how we're dealing with enforcement.
Also, Cymene, would you like to add an answer to that question as well, speaking from a broader perspective beyond Houston as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. Environmental justice, it's such a capacious and such a broad category. And there's so many ways to sort of fold justice into these projects. So one thing I like about environmental justice is the way that it can like bring in all these other issues at the same time, right, under this broader category. And so when I think about it, like what is a definition of environmental justice, at least for me, it really is a question of human rights. Like it's a kind of human rights question more than anything, because it's about providing the kinds of access to non-toxic, safe, comfortable spaces of well-being for everyone, right? It's a right and a condition that all human beings should be able to have. And then as I take it a little bit further, I think it's kind of a non-human right too, right? And by non-human, I mean those other creatures that we share these ecosystems with, those plants and other biotic beings that are so important to our own environmental sustainability on a global level. So that's bayous that are healthy and safe. And so there's a relationship between those two ideas of a kind of human rights that environmental justice can exercise, as well as these non-human rights that all fold into the same kind of ecosystemic picture. So I think that's really important. And just to follow up on what Denae was saying, which is so right on about how do you sort of achieve this. I mean, it's a big project. Like I think sometimes it can feel really overwhelming because it is so huge, it's so capacious, it's so global. So how do we do it? But clearly there are policy and regulatory structures that still need doing and need to happen. But I think that we also need some cultural and attitudinal changes, right? That really have to do with how we relate to each other, the kind of respect and recognition that we give to one another, as well as the rest of the natural world. So that's, from the kind of the point of view of anthropology, like these big cultural changes need to happen, attitudinal changes need to happen, in addition to policy measures and regulations that clearly need to happen as well.
And if I can add to that,
Okay,
yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. I think when we talk about environmental justice or environmental injustice and how to move forward, I think we also have to talk about power and how the power of industry, the power of our systems and the way that they have been set up, and those structures that we accept, right? We accept as the only way that we can build things or plan cities or make streets or think about where we place schools, or how many freeways or how big of a freeway we need. I think that there's a lot of power, going back to this concept of our systems don't center human rights, and they don't center humanity, and they don't center community. And yet they are managed and run and upheld by people, by humans, right? And so, I think that in a place, especially like Houston, where development and developers and industry and the things that really make our economy run also hold a lot of power in other places and in other systems. And I think, if you look at movements for environmental justice across the country, across the world, it's really about community coming together and organizing and building power and activating their power and building coalition. And of course, I work for a coalition, so I believe in the power of collaboratives. But I do think that power structures don't yield power just because they're asked to, right? It takes pressure. It takes coordinated, intentional, strategic pressure and a coalition of voices to really advance that. And that's true of any significant policy change in any sector in the history of our country. And so to that sort of cultural piece that Cymene is lifting up, I think, what we're seeing and what there are pockets of that have been going for a long time in Houston that, we're trying to connect and strengthen and amplify, especially as we think about sort of how climate change is already at our front doorstep and how it is amplifying all of these environmental justice issues that we face. Houston is unique in many different ways. And I think that uniqueness and things like this moment of being in a global pandemic shows us our connectivity and how we need to treat issues as intersectional issues and not in a silo. And that the individual actions of all of us together are very powerful. And that is how we will achieve environmental justice.
Thank you. Next question will go to Amy first. What particular environmental and climate problems does the Houston region face?
We have a lot of problems. As wonderful as Houston is, and as much as we love it, we have a lot of problems. I think Denae kicked it off with no zoning is number one for communities on fence lines. We work directly with these communities to try to keep unwanted environmental, industrial nuisances out of their communities. But it can be anything from a truck yard that shows up in a residential neighborhood that the city will allow to go forward if there's no deed restrictions to prevent that, or a concrete batch plant. And there's some communities that are living directly on the fence line of refineries, like Manchester, if you've ever been there. I think if some people really took some tours of some neighborhoods, I think there's a toxic tour, I think, Sim, that you referenced earlier, it will be really eye-opening as far as how close people are living in proximity to industry and things that are potentially bad for their health. I would also identify traffic as one of our biggest problems as a contributor to greenhouse gases, as well as just our ability to overcome some of the climate change challenges we have on the horizon. Flooding is obviously one that we're all very, very familiar with now, but it can't be overlooked, the importance of that, and as well as how much we need to continue to work on that as we continue to have hurricanes in November. I mean, Zeta is just blowing my mind. And then we have heat islands. I think all this concrete jungle, if you're not looking at the temperature lately, it has been going up and up and up. And thank goodness it's a cold day for Iris, but it has been historically much hotter in the last few years. And Houston is a heat island where we're going to continue to have extreme temperatures in the core of the city that we need to all be cognizant of. I think the last thing I would add to the list that maybe a lot of people aren't thinking about is mosquitoes. with our flooding and our heat, we attract mosquitoes. And as we are all in a pandemic right now and very aware of COVID, there are a lot of diseases that mosquitoes carry that can be very detrimental to human health. And given certain conditions, that if we don't do a well enforcing illegal dumping or tires in certain neighborhoods, we are just asking for a proliferation of mosquitoes in those areas. And again, creating a menace to human health that we really need to focus on for our low income communities. So that's kind of my top 6 list. Feel free to add to it, other panels. I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on those. Thanks.
So I don't know that I need to add to it, Amy, but what I will say is that it's important to point out that many of the communities that are bombarded with the environmental issues are also the same communities that are really impacted by climate change. And so those are the communities that we see repeated flooding. And so if you are experiencing environmental exposures, if you have flooding in that community, then what happens to all of those toxins? Where do they go? Into our water supply? You know, what really happens when it floods? So Hurricane Harvey, we know, was a great example of that, where we saw all of this toxic pollution that ended up in water streams, right? Because of Hurricane Harvey and flooding. I think the other thing is those communities that we talk about with pollution exposures also experience heat islands. So if you're low income and you don't have a lot of funds and it's really hot outside, what do? You open your windows, where so then that pollution then comes in and that exacerbates your respiratory concerns like asthma and bronchitis and things like that. So I just wanted to kind of make sure we understood that the environmental justice communities are severely impacted by the climate change effects as well.
Yeah, if I could add to that real quick, I would echo that. You know, we often talk about the climate crisis as a multiplier of conditions that are already on the ground. And so for a place like Houston, all of the issues that the other panelists have lifted up, you know, if we don't prioritize those places, if we don't prioritize those people, if we don't talk about those issues at the intersection that they exist, and understand how they connect to things like the legacy of institutional racism and systemic racism, in things and in policies like the inherently discriminatory federal policy of cost benefit analysis. As you know, flood mitigation projects are prioritized, that a municipality, a city or a county has to explain what the return on that investment, that federal dollar, is going to be, and uses property value to make that calculation, and not the value of human life. And so to put, you know, property over people, and to put, you know, politics over people, these are ways that our communities have been harmed for generations. And so when we're talking about these issues, it's not new. It kind of evolves and gets a different label, you know, and different books call it different things, but it's the same problem, it's the same themes. And so especially for Houston, a place where when we do have those hurricanes, you know, we're in immediate response and recovery mode. And as those, you know, the lapses of time in between each of those grows smaller or overlaps consistently in every hurricane season, it can be a lot to kind of manage and to get your head around. You can't be planning and be future thinking when you're always responding and in an emergency mode. And so, you know, I think all of those conditions have led to severe disinvestment in our communities. And so, you know, when you work with communities in Northeast Houston who are fighting for drainage justice, right? They just want to have drains that drain properly, and they want, you know, capital improvement money to be funneled to their neighborhood, to their front yard, to their backyard. They want to see those investments in their communities, and we know that there's a disparity in those investments, and that money, both because of the federal policies like the cost benefit analysis I mentioned, and other practices at the local level. You know, we have watersheds that are much more protected than lower income and black and brown, predominantly black and brown watersheds, and we have investments that are not equally and equitably distributed across our city. And so, those are particular problems that we need to, that again will only be amplified and only will be made worse as climate change continues to impact us. And so we need to address them and talk about them and understand their connections, and what those connections then make us do in terms of actions to address them.
Cymene, what have you found in looking at climate justice in other cultural contexts, and how does Houston compare to other cultures? What have you learned elsewhere that might be applied here?
Yeah, so this is a good question, and it's really hard to talk about a global context. But I've been doing research in Mexico, primarily in the state of Oaxaca, for about 10 years now, and then the last 3 to 4 years I've been working in the Arctic region. And when I think about these two very different places with very different histories, right, different geolocations in the world, and thinking about some of their similarities, one of the things that they share is that there's a lot less skepticism about climate science than we have here in the United States. And I find that fascinating, right? As I do research in different parts of the world, that there is an acknowledgement about the empirical evidence that scientists have brought to the question of climate change and the anthropogenic or human caused root of climate change or the climate crisis, in many parts of the world, and yet we're still struggling with that here in the United States and in Houston. Yes, but I think it's broader than that, right? It's at the national level where there's still a lot of skepticism, and I think that that's a really important distinction. I When we talk about climate change in the United States, this is something that's really fascinated me for a long time, and I talk to students about this. Is we phrase it like this: we say, "Do you believe in climate change?" Right? Do you believe? Like, it's sort of like, do you believe in Santa Claus? Or do you believe that a lucky penny is going to bring you luck, right? It's taken us this kind of article of faith rather than something that is something that has reached a scientific consensus, that's understood in the scientific community, and that has an empirical backing to it. So we have this weird way of thinking, not everyone, but many people in the United States still have this strange way of thinking about the climate and the impacts as some kind of article of faith, like a kind of whether it's a belief structure rather than something that is agreed upon by the scientific community. So there's a kind of ideological issue there too. And also, when I look at the work that I've been doing in Mexico, many of the people there they get environmental justice in a really kind of a very clear way because they've been living with histories of dispossession and crises around agriculture in particular in Oaxaca. And so, it may have a new name, environmental justice, but it's a process that's very familiar to people who have been living this for many centuries, and most recently with climate change the last couple of decades, where they really recognize and get it on an experiential level. And in Iceland, up in the Arctic region, this is a place that these are the first humans to occupy that island. 1,200 years ago, the first Icelanders showed up on the island, and it was a very desolate and isolated place. Now they're losing 11 billion tons of ice every year because of climate change and global warming, because the Arctic is heating at a very quick rate. And so they're seeing these effects very immediately, right? They're living it in their landscape. So I think there's these two different dimensions. There's a sort of experiential dimension, and then there's this kind of ideological or conceptual dimension that we need to work through in a really concerted way. And as we look around the world, we see different approaches, and some of them are working better than others. And so I hope that in Houston and in Texas and the United States, we can start to adopt some of those attitudes and views that they're going to be, we can operationalize in a more productive and better way to create a better sense of equality environmentally.
Thank you. Next, we will ask, how do environmental problems affect women in particular? And we can start with Denae for that one, if you'd like to answer.
Sure. So I'm a mother. I'm a mother of three, and so as a mother, for me, and the environment is everything in terms of how I take care of myself, how I take care of myself in terms of if I choose to be reproductive, to participate in the reproductive process, whether or not I want to breastfeed my baby. There are so many phases in your life as a woman that the environment can impact you. And so it's really important for us. And I think that there's not a lot of work. So we don't do a lot of work, truthfully, when you think about it. There's not a whole lot of literature really looking at women and the different phases of our lives and how various environmental contaminants, really impact that. Um, but there are certainly, there are some clear examples of environmental contaminants that impact our reproduction. There are contaminants that we know that can be transferred from our with our breast milk in terms of being deposited in lipids. And so there's a significant impact on women in terms of what they're exposed to and how they then transfer those exposures to their children. So those are just my thoughts.
How can a city like Houston, known as the energy capital of the world, as well as a place identified with environmental injustice, reconcile economic and environmental needs? We'll start with Amy.
Okay, I've got a couple bullet points on this one. I think first we've got to put people over profits. We need industry and government to be part of that solution, and we've got to reallocate resources, starting with how we do permitting in Houston and identify that certain communities have less than and need more. That's just as a start. And I think industry should bear some of that burden of communities that they are polluting, and making sure that those communities have investment and are a better place to live. I think that's the minimum industry can do to be better neighbors to communities that they are adjacent to. Health costs. All of these health costs impact everyone. They are one of the reasons why we can't get to providing good health care for everyone. And it is an extreme cost to taxpayers to have to treat people on an emergency level. And the fact that people are living in conditions that are degrading their health on a daily basis is something that costs us all as a society. And we should all realize the universal good that could come from taking better care of all of our health. I think in the pandemic, maybe that's starting to hit home a little bit. And I think we need to invest in all communities in Houston. We have our tourist system, which reallocates dollars. We have a gilded galleria, that's what I like to call it. And we have other communities that don't even have basic drainage that Iris mentioned earlier. And that disparity is heartbreaking when you understand the impact that has on families as well as their pathway to success. When you start out with a multitude of challenges that are just basically related to your environment and your trip to your elementary school and the challenges that are associated with having childhood asthma because you are living near a refinery and it's hard to breathe and concentrate in school, much less other complications that are directly due to being low income, and not having access to opportunities for better jobs or education opportunities here in Houston, which is a problem as we've recognized with HISD recently. These are all things that we need to do better at. And I think, again, government and industry are part of that problem, part of that solution, and having the people have more say in this. And that's one of the things our organization tries to do is work with communities to get those community voices included in permitting processes, included in planning processes, included in things that are directly impacting their communities so they have a voice in the process and they don't feel like things are happening to them. They are taking control and having power, like Iris mentioned. That's critical to have those voices involved in the process because they're the ones that know what's best for their neighborhoods.
Iris or Denae, would either of you like to add something to this?
Sure. I think the first thing that we have to do is come to an agreement that we must make a decision to reduce emissions here in the city of Houston. Um, we can come up with all kinds of ideas and strategies, but if we can't all agree that we have to come up with some plan to reduce emissions in Houston, then we're just kind of talking around the bullet. And so once we can come to an agreement on that, I think it's easy to come up with some clean energy solutions. There are ways to deal with the economic impacts of transitioning, taking the time to really transition to cleaner energy options that reduce the carbon footprint. Those options include ways to provide solar jobs and other types of jobs that will work, that will allow our environmental justice communities and the people that are most harmed by pollution to have good wages and a way to actually take care of their families, all while making the city of Houston a safer and cleaner place to live. I think that we have to come to an understanding, as Amy said, that people's lives should come before the economic opportunities that we have here. And if we can't agree that we need to reduce emissions, I don't know that we'll ever get there.
Yeah, just one quick thing, just Denae, like as you were saying, like renewable energy needs to be the new energy for Houston, period. Like full stop. That's it. And we have so much capacity, right? I mean, we already have good renewable companies in the city. That just needs to be expanded. It just needs to multiply. And for better or worse, we kind of live in the belly of the beast here. We have this proximity to industry, and so many people that we know in our lives and professionally work within the industry. So there's ways to create that kind of pressure too from the inside through different kind of campaigns of lobbying also. So I just want to second that really important note.
And if you're interested, I'm also going to put it in the chat. The larger environmental groups actually partnered with some of the smaller environmental justice groups to come up with a national climate policy agenda. And it's called the Equitable and Just Climate Agenda. And it's very detailed. It's really easy to understand. And it gives some really great suggestions and solutions in terms of how to really present an agenda that includes everybody and really is focused on making sure we all, as you said earlier, have an opportunity to live in a healthy and a safe environment. So I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe underscore, especially because they're in our backyard and because we are the oil and gas and the energy capital, to rebrand, right? The energy capital of the world. And Amy touched on this, but the important role that industry can play and should play, because the reality is that they knew about climate change for a long time and spent a lot of money to lie about it. And those real costs of recovery, those real costs of infrastructure investment, those real costs of climate gentrification, how folks are moving around and being pushed around and forced out of their communities. Those are real dollar amounts, and those are dollar amounts that we're all paying for. And so really this notion of having polluters pay their fair share, just as taxpayers are paying and shouldering the burden of the real costs of the climate crisis. I just wanted to highlight that as one important part of the solution as we transition, and really having transparency around that, right? I think we do see that industry invests in things like disaster recovery, invests in things like the planning processes that our city has undergone in the last 12 to 18 months. But I think the community needs to be able to really guide and decide and measure and evaluate how those resources are used, what impacts they will have, and evaluate whether or not they are successful. So I just wanted to underline that as an important part of the solution of how we reconcile those economic and environmental needs and the important role that industry can and should play in that.
Perfect. And I think you actually just touched on one of our audience questions, which was, should polluting industries be responsible for paying reparations to adjacent communities suffering from the pollution that they emit? We'll get back to the audience questions in just a second, but before we continue with audience questions, I would like for everybody to answer kind of one last question, which is, how do you see your work and the work of other women contributing to environmental justice? And how can members of the audience work for environmental justice? And in that, if we could focus on types of climate action at local and in the Houston levels, that would also be really helpful, because that would also touch on another audience question. And we can start with Iris for that and then continue from there.
Sure. So, as I think about the people that make up SEER, and the folks who are at meetings and who are doing the work, it's like 98% women. And so in most spaces where we're doing this work, it's a lot of women. And I also, just think of a lot of community champions and community residents who I consider giants in this field who are women. And I think that, women in our, and I'll say that framing it this way excludes people who don't fall into the gender binary. And so I just want to name that as well. But I think that, women bring a certain type of shared leadership style and a really trust-driven type of relationship building and working together. And I think that that's those types of skills, that type of approach is really necessary for what we're describing as this really big, gnarly, intersectional, long time ago started major issue that's impacting all of us. And so I think that the skills that women bring cannot be understated to the conversation. And so I feel very inspired by the women on this panel and the women that I work with in community and the women that make up SEER. I would say that for, sort of a call to action, how people can get involved, no matter where you are, is to really pay attention and to look for the stories that you're not being told, right? I think the other major function that women serve is that we're great storytellers, and that we are the bearers of culture and history. And so if you don't know about the cancer clusters and what's happening in Fifth Ward and Kashmir Gardens, and if you don't know about the drainage justice issues that neighborhoods like Lakewood are facing, research that, Google those words, get involved. There are, especially right now, a number of groups who are highlighting that work. And I think that, as we think about the climate action plan that the city put forth earlier this year, that's now moving into implementation, there are working groups, there are ways for people to get involved and kind of pay attention. But what we need everyone to be asking for is that those places that we consider climate justice or environmental justice neighborhoods, that they get prioritized, that we make sure that they don't get left behind, that a successful implementation of the climate action plan means that we would achieve climate justice in those places, in those neighborhoods, and for those people. And so that's a message that everyone, no matter what your gender, what your background, where you live, needs to be asking the city for, and we really need your help with that.
Amy, would you like to jump in next?
Sure. So I do community lawyering. How I see my work as a mentor for other young lawyers. I have a great, talented staff, a lot of women, but I see that as a critical part of the success of our group in the last 3 years, as far as outreaching to communities, building trust, understanding what the particular issues are in communities, and then figuring out legal solutions on how to move forward for their benefit. And one of the things we've done is recognizing that we cannot fight every single concrete batch permit. We don't have enough resources to do that. We've been very successful in that space, but ultimately long-term, we have to put deed restriction protections back in communities, which is a challenging thing because there are racial stigmas associated with how those legal documents were originally drafted, and a lot of subdivisions in the area were originally founded on deed restrictions that were discriminatory against racial minorities. And we have to overcome that legacy and realize that those are the only protections that may exist in Houston for communities, and explain to them the importance of putting those in place to make sure that their neighborhoods are protected. And so we're really focused on community preservation as a long-term solution that includes, and this is where you can get involved, getting involved in what's going on in your community, joining your local civic club, figuring out what your super neighborhood is, and when they're meeting, and finding out this, plugging into this larger network of information that is out there on how things are impacting your community and what decisions are being made about your community when you're not there. This is the critical thing that we have to do, particularly in a large city like Houston. You have to get involved at your neighborhood level and realize what is going on, network with your neighbors, talk to your neighbors, and share that information with them. Because I think if people really understood the impacts, like we've seen the outpouring on the I-45 project from lots of communities, and it pushed things to get better. And so we need to keep that energy up on these large infrastructure projects. We need to have that energy on a lot of the decisions that are being made in government on behalf of communities. And so I would just really stress the best thing you can do is go to your local civic club meeting and figure out what's going on that directly impacts your neighborhood, because you have power in those groups to make change for your community.
Cymene and then Denae.
Well, I'll just echo, what I think has already been said, and that is, we need to collectively embrace this caring imperative. And Denae, I thought you brought it up really nicely when you were talking about mothering, right? And again, this doesn't have to be gendered, and it doesn't have to be a kind of an essentialized or reductive position, but prioritizing relationships is the place to begin. And it turns out that women are fairly good at doing that. And so that's something that I think we should collectively embrace, from a non-binary point of view, or, from a woman's point of view, right? Is that this is a really important place for us to come together, but also embrace that kind of inclination or orientation. And, when I think about the female leadership that we've seen through COVID, right, on a global level, we look at a place like New Zealand with Jacinda Ardern, and they did a really good job. Her leadership was, phenomenal, and they had, no cases when we were blowing up here in Houston. Or where I've been doing research in Iceland, the prime minister there did also a phenomenal job, and in Germany with Angela Merkel. So when I look around and look at these examples of leadership that have to do obviously with health, but also with a kind of prioritization of relationships and caring for one's population, right? The evidence is there. And I think, again, we just need to find good examples like that and try and reproduce them as much as we can here at all levels, right? Not just at the national level, but at the community levels as well, which is the work that you all are doing too, like, day in and day out.
So I have the pleasure of actually being mentored by some of the women who have historically been major forces in the EJ movement, such as Dr. Beverly Wright out of New Orleans with the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice, Peggy Shepard with We Act in New York. These are women who have been working in the environmental justice movement for over 40 years. They have great instincts on what works, what doesn't work, and they are women who lead with passion and compassion. And I think that is very critical when you work with communities. So as Amy said, most of our leaders that we work with are female leaders. They are often volunteers, so they're not paid to do this work. They do it because they have a passion for it, because they are committed to the communities that they represent. And so I feel like one of the ways that you can get involved is to donate to some of these organizations. So some of the smaller organizations that we get to work with have very little funding. And so most of this work is really done by residents, and it's done with limited funds. And so being able to provide some funding for the leaders to maybe do this work full time would be awesome. Providing them with funds for their organizations to have infrastructure to really function. And so I think that's a great way to get involved. I think the other thing too is as fellow citizens, we need to really think about how funds are spent, how policies are made, both on a local and a national level, and really consider how historical, racial segregation and injustice might play a part in that. So oftentimes a policy is put in place and we never think about how it might actually impact a minority community. And so thinking about who has the power in terms of, who's making those decisions. Are there people of color and low income people really at the table? Are they able to really participate and give their input on how those funds are being spent? And Iris can speak to, how funds are being spent in terms of recovery with Hurricane Harvey. These are really important things, and elect people that are like-minded, people that are really going to be compassionate and think about other people in terms of how policies impact communities. I think those are all really important things, and I am continued to be motivated by phenomenal female leaders. For the women on this panel, a great example in Iris, I hope she won't get upset with me sharing it. So I'm also a part of SEER. Iris sent out an email today letting us know she was applying for a grant on behalf of the organization. She shared every part of what was going to happen with the grant. So, shared leadership and being very transparent is not something we see a lot. And so I'm really motivated by the female leaders that we get to work with in this movement.
Oh, and actually, we didn't say the obvious one. Everyone should go vote because all of these issues are on the ballot right now, and you can early vote through Friday, and you can vote on the day of on Tuesday. So you should vote. That is one very powerful way that you can take an action right now.
I think that because voting got brought up, something that might be good to have somebody answer could be, what advice would you give to a political leader at the national, state, or local level about how to address climate justice? Maybe what kind of policies do you look for when you look for climate policy in a candidate?
I think one of the basic things they can do is go see the environmental justice communities in their district and understand the challenges, see the challenges that the people are living under, as far as drainage conditions, access to, a lot of our communities are food deserts. They don't have access to good grocery stores. Some of them don't have access to banks. There's a number of things that I guess handicap these communities for lack of resources and investment in them that have nothing to do with the people that live there. It's just the environment as built is not conducive to having healthy people. And we need to make those changes. And I think if people understood how close some of these refineries are to homes, they would be like, I don't want to live there. And I think if people would just take a step back and try to put themselves, have some empathy and understanding, compassion for circumstances that some people have no control over, as far as what environment they're being brought up in, because there's not a way to redress that, particularly in Houston when there's no zoning. And if people started to understand the real economic impact on these families of these circumstances that they're in, I think that would be one of the most eye-opening and effective ways to get people to put the people first, like I mentioned.
Yeah, I just want to underscore something that has come up a few times in the discussion, which is really about, good policy that is really going to make a difference. I think needs to be intersectional, right? So people who understand how housing justice is climate justice, and environmental justice is climate justice. And, you know, that all of these things are connected, and that to be talking about things like environmental equity and achieving, achieving equity across our systems, we have to, it doesn't mean that, you know, a climate plan or climate policy needs to take on all of that, but it needs to understand how that problem sits within that context, that broader context, and how a solution, if it's going to work, needs to actually address all of those intersections. And so I think that's a really important one. Something else that I've heard from our discussion today that I think is worth emphasizing is just how community has a meaningful and authentic and real seat at the table, right? We've seen a lot of task forces, a lot of advisory bodies, a lot of working groups. And I think that, you know, what happens when you bring together the different types of expertise, because we consider community members experts, they know what they need, they know what they want, they are closest to the problem, they have the best solutions. And so, yes, we need the folks who are, you know, trained in different fields of study and who have all the letters after their names and have the title and have, you know, the technical expertise. And we also need the lived experiences and the lived expertise of community members. And when you combine those two things, you get really amazing results. And so I think being able to really test and ask and analyze, how is community involved in the designing of that policy? How is community involved from start to finish in crafting that policy, in vetting that policy, and implementing that policy, and evaluating the success of that policy? That's not something that we see very often, and that's really what we need, is that partnership between community and decision makers. So I think those would be good questions to ask.
We have about 2 minutes until 7. So if there are any attendees who do have a question, feel free to drop in the chat, the Q&A, or raise your hand and I can unmute you. Okay, one of the questions in the Q&A currently is about action at the Houston level, and I think we've done a pretty good job addressing that, especially in terms of voting.
I think there was another question in the chat that was asking about whether the recording would be distributed after the
Yes. Yes, it will be made available, and we will be able to, it will most likely be made available through the Fondren website, and then we will advertise that.
Is this a good time to plug this book?
Sure.
Book. Sorry, I feel like it is an important book. I have not had a chance to read it yet, but I know this was one of the motivations for this panel. So I don't know, Ashley, if you want to share those details with the listeners.
I can drop in the title and author.
Okay.
It's getting a lot of attention too, a lot of positive feedback as people are reading it. And it's great because it's an edited collection, so they're short pieces, so you can fit it into your life, you know. And I've just read a few of the essays, but it's really fantastic work, and a really diverse group of writers too. So that's nice. I was wondering, Ashley, like one of the things that I think Denae brought up was being able to donate to different organizations. I don't know if you can do this as part of Fondren, but it'd be great to have a list of good organizations that people could go to their website and make a donation if they can. Sort of click on the sites. I don't know if that's okay with Rice or if there's some regulation against that, but I think it'd be really useful to have.
That could be worth looking into. And we did just get another question. So somebody asked, they said they've been a petro engineer for 13 years and it kills my soul, but I don't know how to change careers. Any suggestions? I know many of you have had nonlinear paths, so this might be a good thing to end on and kind of just give maybe some inspiration or hope to anybody who is looking at getting involved in this, whether they've been in a career for a really long time or they're maybe a student looking to join a career path that is related to the environment. And then we can close.
I think the future is green jobs, and I would love to see and I know there are layoffs happening right now because of the downturn in the oil and gas, but I would love to see the brain power that is in the industry right now start to transition and do some startups, get us some green energy jobs. Let's compete with Austin on being and making turning that corner and making Houston the green energy capital of the world. We have the knowledge and expertise here, and particularly with our medical complex, we have chances for bioengineering solutions in addition to green jobs. I mean, there is so much opportunity with Rice, with TSU, with all of the University of Houston and our educational institutions that are here. We can own this and rule this. We just need to put the people just like you who are looking to make a change and do something better in their trained profession for the environment. We welcome you. Join the fight and tell us what the next big thing could be and show us that Houston's capable of producing it. I mean, we have so much potential here with what we already have. We just need to shift gears, and that's what I mean by saying industry has to be part of our solution to transition. But let's be the green energy capital of the world.
I agree with Amy. I think that we need people who understand the petrochemical industry to really help us design new ways to use clean energy. I think that you could look for opportunities to work in sustainability and resilience kinds of arenas where you can help people understand maybe how to reduce the carbon footprint, zero emission kinds of work. There are lots of different areas that you could, potentially pivot to because of your engineering training. And especially if you have some experience working, I think that there are certainly some opportunities. So don't be discouraged. We need you. And I think you just need to look for some ways to take your training and just, look at it in terms of your skill set and not necessarily your area. So think about your skill set and how to pivot it into some areas really focused on resilience and sustainability, maybe.
Yeah. And I'll just add too that, as we move into this transition, which we are and we will continue to be, is that it's really important that we not reproduce the extractive and exploitative orientation that the fossil fuel industry has had since its inception. So that the way that the fossil fuel industry has worked historically, we need to move away from that entirely as we go into new renewable energy forms and make sure that, as you've brought up a couple of times now, Iris, that communities are at the table, having decision-making power over where new renewable energy centers are sited, for example, what kinds of policies are put into place. We need to be, I think we have this huge opportunity now with transition to do energy better than we ever had in the past. And we need to really embrace that opportunity and say that we're not going to repeat these exploitative and expropriative and extractive practices that have been so central to the fossil fuel industry. We need to do it better with renewable energy, and we can bring a new political ethos. We can bring a new set of politics to these new energy forms, right? And I think that's where we really need to focus some of our energies too,
Thank you guys. So we are now 5 minutes past 7. So to be conscious of everybody's time, I'm going to go ahead and close us off. I know there is still maybe a couple questions that people might have, but this recording will be available after. So thank you guys so much. And I hope that everybody has a nice evening. Thank you guys for being here. Thanks to all of our attendees for being here as well.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ashley, for moderating as well.
Yes, thank you.
See you out there.
Take care, everybody. Stay safe.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.